The Suez Canal is the first man-made waterway that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. It was developed by the former French consul of Cairo, Ferdinand de Lesseps, to substantially reduce sailing route between Europe and Asia. The canal that was completed in 1869 added great value to international trade, making it a nearly direct source of conflict among Egypt's neighbors and Cold War superpowers. In 1888, the Convention of Constantinople declared the Suez Canal as a neutral zone open to ships of all nations in times of both war and peace. Britain, who had by then assumed control of Egypt and Sudan, became the guarantor of neutrality of the canal that was operated by the British and French-owned Suez Canal Company. In 1936, the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty confirmed the role of the United Kingdom in the canal. Under the terms of the treaty, Egypt was declared an independent sovereign state, and the United Kingdom was required to withdraw all its troops from Egypt, except those deemed necessary to protect Britain's financial and strategic interest in the canal.
In 1954, Colonel Jamal Abdel Nasser took control of Egypt. He had three goals: ending British occupation of Egypt, building up an army for a successful attack on Israel, and modernizing Egypt by construction of a high dam at Aswan to irrigate the Nile Valley. In the same year, Nasser signed an agreement with Britain stating that British troops were to be withdrawn from Egypt by June 1956, and the British bases were to be run jointly by British and Egyptian civilian technicians. British troops would be permitted to return if the Suez Canal was threatened by an outside power. In February of 1955, Anglo-Egyptian affairs were strained once more by Britain's decision to deprive Nasser of promised arms. Nasser purchased Soviet-made aircrafts, tanks, and arms from Czechoslovakia to realize one of his goals, the destruction of Israel. Britain followed and retracted its offer of aid. The World Bank then refused to advance Egypt a promised $200 million. Accordingly, on the 26th of July 1956, President Nasser nationalized the Anglo-French Suez Canal Company, declaring that the revenue from the canal will finance the dam. Britain looked into military action aiming at Nasser's downfall and at restoring its influence on the region. The United States, who had emerged from World War II as a global superpower and as a former colony itself, was committed to overseeing the decolonization of the globe, opposed the British decision. Israel, on the other hand, was greatly concerned about Egypt's arming, and it started a series of border clashes with Egypt. The French government, who was the main supplier of weapons to Israel, had been meeting secretly with Israel and inviting Britain to join the negotiations.
In October 1956, the three allies concluded a secret agreement that Israel should attack Egypt, thereby providing a pretext for an Anglo-French invasion of the Suez. This is what caused the Suez Crisis, known as the Second Arab-Israeli War. The Israeli attack started on October 29, 1956. Nasser's army was withdrawing. On the 5th of November, the Anglo-French assault on the Suez was launched. The Egyptian forces were quickly overwhelmed, and the Anglo-French military operation was well on its way to being a great success. At midnight, on the 6th of November, a ceasefire was called on the insistence of the UN Secretary-General. The United States was concerned that Egypt would align itself with the Soviet Union, wanted to avoid an armed conflict with the Soviet Union, and saw the Suez Crisis as a distraction from the Soviet Union's brutal suppression of an uprising in Hungary. The US hence threatened to dump both the British and French currencies, paving the way for a financial crisis in both countries. The Soviet Union threatened to intervene to support Egypt. Public outrage rose against the attack in Britain. Canada put pressure on the UN to deploy large-scale United Nations peacekeeping force to de-escalate tension in Egypt. All this forced Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw their troops from Egypt. A United Nations peacekeeping force was sent in to supervise the ceasefire and restore order. The Suez Canal was reopened under the control of Egypt.
After the Suez Crisis, Britain and France, who were once the seat of empires, found their influence as world powers weakened as the United States and Soviet Union took a more powerful role in world affairs. Britain international relations suffered following the crisis. The crisis made Abdel Nasser a powerful hero in the growing Arab and Egyptian nationalist movements. Israel, while it did not gain the right to utilize the canal, was granted rights to ship goods along the Straits of Tyran. The cost of the battle incurred by Britain was not the only economic loss of the country. Economic threats from the US and UN caused a panic in Britain and resulted in tens of millions of pounds being lost. Britain had to devalue its currency. Moreover, the US put pressure on the International Monetary Fund to deny Britain any financial assistance. And this triggered a huge political backlash in Britain and led to an economic crisis. In Egypt, although Nasser increased the country's income from the canal, the deteriorated international relations affected the country's economy negatively. Egypt's foreign currency assets from Britain, France, and the US were frozen. Trade relations with the United Kingdom ceased, and those with France and the United States declined. Moreover, the canal's blockade for several months, along with the cost of mobilizing the forces, severely affected the Egyptian economy.
10 years after the ending of the Suez crisis, tensions were still high between Egypt and Israel, and eventually the two countries fought during the 6 Days War. Egypt shut down the canal again following this war and Israel's occupation of the Sinai Peninsula. For the next 8 years, the Suez Canal, which separates the Sinai from the rest of Egypt, existed as the front line for any conflict between the Egyptian and Israeli armies. In 1975, Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat reopened the Suez Canal as a gesture of peace after talks with Israel. Today, an average of 50 ships navigate the canal daily, carrying more than 300 million tons of goods a year.